Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a good day so far today. Welcome to my online presentation. It's regrettable that it has to be online, but we have to use what we've got. So, this presentation is partially a commemoration for the tragedy that occurred on May 4th in 1970. This presentation examines Ohio State marker 8-67, which is the May 4th commemorative marker, alongside South Carolina State marker 38-27 and Mississippi Freedom Trail marker number 6, which commemorate the Orangeburg Massacre and Jackson State tragedy, respectively. The sources that were primarily used were the images of the markers, as well as the text from the markers themselves, both of which are geared towards educating the public on the event, as well as commemorating the event itself. So, before I start, I'm going to first lay out my methodology. I will follow that by examining the markers themselves in chronological order, beginning with Orangeburg in the bottom left corner, followed by Kent State, which is denoted in the middle of the screen, and finally Jackson State, which is in the bottom right of the screen. Firstly, we got to start with the historical context of what happened in Orangeburg. February 8th, 1968, students at South Carolina State University were protesting for the desegregation of an all-white bowling alley known as the All-Star Bowling Lanes. After escalating tensions, South Carolina Highway Patrol officers fired into a group of students at the bowling alley for between a 10 and 15-second time frame. Henry R. Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano B. Middleton were all killed, and 27 other students were injured. Next, about 2 years later at Kent State, May 4th, 1970, student protests over the U.S. involvement in Cambodia, the escalating tensions between the students in the town over the weekend, and the occupation of the campus by the Ohio National Guard ended when the Ohio National Guard opened fire into a crowd of student protesters, unloading 61 to 67 rounds in 13 seconds. Allison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schuer, and William Schroeder were all killed, and 9 other students were injured. At Jackson State, not quite 2 weeks later, students at Jackson State were protesting white harassment, the killing of the Kent State demonstrators on May 4th, and a rumor that Mayor Charles Evers and his wife were killed, subsequently where the demonstrators overturned a truck as a result. Students began to congregate outside Alexander Hall, which prompted the Mississippi police to open fire, unloading approximately 480 rounds in 30 seconds. Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green were both killed, and an estimated 12 to 30 students were injured. So now we have to look at the methodology that I'm using, and I'm using a methodology that consists of 5 portions and can be found in an article titled Seeing the Past and the Present Through Archives and the Landscape by our very own Dr. Post. In this article, Dr. Post highlights his 5-point framework, the first point being identifying the community. The second point is identifying when the landscape itself was produced, followed by identifying where within the community the memorial is located, the fourth point being who produced the landscape, and the fifth point being identifying the text of the memorial itself. All 5 of these points are integral to determining what the narrative of the event is and who is controlling this discussion. The first point of examination I'd like to look at is the word cloud that you see on screen now. I was actually inspired to add this after reading a project by Matthew Cook titled The Textual Politics of Alabama's Historical Markers. In this article, Dr. Cook inserted the text from all of the markers he examined into a word cloud, with words that appeared more frequently becoming larger. My word cloud is not as elaborate as Dr. Cook's word cloud in his article, because I'm dealing with a significantly smaller pool of words as I only used 3 markers. On my word cloud, which combines all 3 of these markers that we're going to look at, words such as student, state, campus, college, guard, Kent, and national appear more frequently, and as such, their text is bigger. And this actually makes sense because all 3 of these markers commemorate student protesting to some degree. Jackson State's marker, as we'll see later, actually even mentions the May 4th tragedy, which is why Kent is rather big on the list. So to start, we're going to look at first the Orangeburg Massacre. looking at the first point, the community, it's located in Orangeburg, South Carolina. When we look at when the landscape was produced, it was erected in 2000, which is roughly 30 years after the event occurred. Dr. Post had actually mentioned this in his previous article, and the discussion on point 2, he talks about how several scholars point out that it actually takes years worth of time before a community is ready to dedicate a memorial to a tragedy. Therefore, them taking this long to erect a memorial is not out of the ordinary by any stretch. Point 3, where it's located. This one is actually located just on South Carolina State University's campus. This is interesting because the event never actually happened on the campus. It actually happened at the All-Star Bowling Alley that was previously mentioned. Point 4 couples with this, who produced it. This was erected by South Carolina State University. 3 and 4 coupled together to show a sense of community that South Carolina State seems to have had beyond the boundaries of their campus. Next is point 5, which you can see on the screen, the text written out. On February 8th, 1968, after 3 nights of escalating racial tension over efforts by South Carolina State College students and others to desegregate the All-Star bowling lanes, 3 students died and 27 others were wounded on this campus. South Carolina Highway Patrolmen fired on a crowd here, killing Samuel Hammond Jr., Delano Middleton, and Henry Smith. This tragedy was the first of its kind on any American college campus. So, we have to look at what's being said now. This text does a very good job recounting what happened at the night of the event, and compared to the other two, this is the most clear-cut of what is going on. The text highlights the racial tension, and it highlights the crux of the conflict. It was in the heart of the South, and racial tension ran rampant. The text also highlights it being the first of its kind on any American college campus, and this ties back to the idea that South Carolina State was a community beyond the borders of the school itself, because this event didn't actually happen on campus, as previously mentioned. Next, we have to look at the Kent State tragedy. The first point, it's located in Kent, Ohio. That's where the community is. Point 2, when it was produced, it was erected in 2006. It was erected 36 years after the event had happened. It is located on the Kent State campus. And for point 4, it was erected by Kent State University and the Ohio Historical Society. The next point, reading the text of the marker, in 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidency partly based on a campaign promise to end the Vietnam War. Though the war seemed to be winding down, on April 30th, 1970, Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, triggering protests across college campuses. On Friday, May 1st, an anti-war rally was held at the Commons at Kent State University. Protesters called for another rally to be held on Monday, May 4th. Disturbances in downtown Kent that night caused city officials to ask Governor James Rhodes to send the Ohio National Guard to maintain order. Troops put on alert Saturday afternoon were called to campus Saturday evening after an ROTC building was set on fire. Sunday morning, in a press conference that was also broadcasted to the troops on campus, Rhodes vowed to eradicate the problem of protests at Kent State. On the back of the sign, it reads, "On May 4th, 1970, Kent State students protesting on the Commons against the U.S. invasion of Cambodia and the presence of the Ohio National Guard called to campus to quell demonstrations. Guardsmen advanced, driving students past Taylor Hall. A small group of protesters taunted the guard from Prentice Hall parking lot. The guard marched back to the pagoda, where members of Company A, 145th Infantry, and Troop G, 107th Armored Cavalry, turned and fired 61 to 67 shots during 13 seconds. 4 students were killed: Allison Krause, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schur, and William Schroeder. 9 students were wounded: Alan Canfora, John Cleary, Thomas Grace, Dean Kaler, Joseph Lewis, D. Scott McKenzie, James Russell, Robert Stamps, and Douglas Wentmore. Those shot were 20 to 245 yards away from the guard. The report of the Presidential Commission on Campus Unrest concluded that the shootings were unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable." Now, that's a lot to unpack, but we're going to do that now. Like Orangeburg, and as we'll see, Jackson State. Kent State's marker also looks at what happened that day and recounts it. However, Kent State's marker seems to be different than the two in the sense that it seems to grapple more with why this had happened. Throughout the marker, you hear about Nixon's campaign promise, you hear about the invasion of Cambodia, the disturbances downtown that weekend, the burning of the ROTC building, the inflammatory language that Governor Rhodes had used in referring to the students, and the protesters taunting the guard as well as the guard retaliating by opening fire. You see all these whys as to what caused this event to come into play. Once the marker determined the why, once that's figured out, it goes on to memorialize the dead and the injured, like Orangeburg and Jackson State do, and concludes the shootings were inexcusable, unnecessary, and unwarranted, as quoted by the President's Commission, giving it a little bit more ethos behind it. Finally, we're going to look at the Jackson State tragedy. So the point one, the community, it's located in Jackson, Mississippi. Point two, when was it produced? It was produced in 2012, nearly 42 years after the event had happened. It is located on Jackson State University, particularly in its western entrance, where there's a rather controversial road that was part of the whole ordeal at Jackson State, called Lynch Street, named after an African American politician during the Reconstruction era. Who produced it? This was actually erected by the Mississippi Developmental Authority Tourism Division. And finally, we have to look at the text itself. The text reads, "Tragedy struck Jackson State College on May 15th, 1970, when Jackson police and Mississippi Highway Patrol officers suppressed a student unrest with gunfire. Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green were killed, and many injured when bullets riddled Alexander Hall and peppered nearby areas. Law enforcement had massed at the college to subdue students protesting harassments from whites driving through campus, police intimidation, and the recent killing of 4 student demonstrators at Kent State University by the Ohio National Guard." So now we have to unpack what's being said here. The Jackson State sign seems to focus more on the results of the tragedy as the primary focal point, as opposed to the why behind it. The why seems to have been an afterthought in a sense. The language choice again highlights how unwarranted the nature of this event was, using intense gunfire primarily to describe what had happened that night. Jackson State also, like Orangeburg, highlights the racial tensions that were plaguing the area at the time, protesting the harassment from whites who drove through campus to harass students on a predominantly black college. Police intimidation also was another point of contention. So now, the question stands, why was Kent State different than these two? Why does Kent State seem to be everywhere while Orangeburg and Jackson State seem to fade into obscurity almost? One of the key differences between the Kent State tragedy and the tragedies at Orangeburg and Jackson State was the racial tensions that plagued Orangeburg and Jackson State. What occurred in Orangeburg and Jackson State happened in the heart of the South, where racial tensions still ran high. The deaths of African Americans in the South at the time seemed to be business as usual, as awful as that is to say now. What happened at Orangeburg and Jackson State wasn't entirely unexpected. Kent State, on the other hand, happened in a northeast Ohio town filled with students from across the country. These students were protesting, trying to make a change to a system they felt wasn't listening to them. The 4 students who died were all white, and 2 of them, Sandra Schuer and William Schroeder, were walking to class. They weren't even participants at the protests. They were bystanders. Kent State was different because despite the red flags, despite the imminent threat that these events that happened over the weekend were building to a boiling point that was going to end badly, 4 white students from archetypical working families were shot and killed on a college campus by National Guardsmen. What happened at Kent State was not business as usual like what happened in the South was. This was the furthest thing from it. So now you may be thinking, so what? What's the conclusion? What's the end goal here? And rightfully so to do that. Ultimately, these markers aren't only memorials to these tragedies that helps us remember this, but these are monuments to our failures as societies. Remembrance is our best way to better ourselves and move past these failures, to ensure that they never occur again. We, as a society and as community members, need these memorials not only to do rights by the lives that were lost and the lives that were injured as a result, but to allow wounds to heal, to allow ourselves to move forward so that we can better ourselves. And only then will we be able to do that. So I apologize for leaving you all on a somber note at that point, but thank you for taking time out of your day to view my presentation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.